We're going to lead our philosophical discussion, and we're going to be looking at standardized testing. And so I just we discussed the topics and things that's near and dear to both of our hearts because we teach, I teach U.S. history and you teach 8th grade Georgia studies. And that is standardized testing because we have a test at the end of our semester.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those hot button topics in education that that seems to be always around, and it's always a buzz, and there's a lot of different ideas on yes or no about these topics. So we wanted to do a little research on standardized testing and kind of talk through it through our philosophers. So it's a very widely debated, but according to EdPost 2021, many point to No Child Left Behind as the moment that standardized tests became controversial. And I would agree with that because obviously it puts so much, like, I guess, importance on a test of a one-day event. And to me, it's, as we kind of went through, No Child Left Behind is gone. It's taken like its toll on the industry. And so standardized test is when all students taking the test have to respond to the same set of carefully selected questions. Usually they're multiple choice or true false, so that they can be fair and objective with little room for ambiguity. And so it's like this blanket test that everybody has to take, and there's no ambiguity in it. And so it kind of puts a teacher in a bubble. So we're going to talk about that as we go through with our philosophers. And then finally, before I'm going to let Shay take over, it is used by educators in their institutions to gauge progress and meet the needs of the students. And so that's the goal of testing. Not sure if it reaches that goal, but we'll talk about that.
Standardized testing, all grade levels use it. So like if you're, both of our experiences is in public school, but those state mandated testing, even like the college tests, ACTs, all that stuff, LSTAT, it's all standardized. And so Carson and I, our experiences with the EOCs and the milestones test, but all levels use it. And the idea is the standardized testing is used by the state and federal governments to improve teaching and learning. And it's all mandated by the No Child Left Behind.
He's a common man who started to believe his own thing.
All right, got us a little interference there.
Yeah, sorry.
As we're both trying to record in our schools, and so obviously,
there's
going to be some ins and outs. So, all right, well, I'll get into the philosopher that I chose to kind of represent in our discussion, and that is John Dewey. And I found this quote from Dewey. He was kind of the one that I guess connected with the most in how he thought and his processing. So education is a social process. Education is growth. Education is not a preparation for life, but is life itself. And so one of the things that I, kind of found interesting about Dewey was he believes, as I believe, that, we're never done growing, and therefore we're never done educating ourselves. So I was in the real world, I guess, so to speak, outside before I became a teacher. And I had to do like an insurance licensing test. I had to do contractors testing. Like I had to do a lot of different types of testing. And so education never stopped for me. And so this makes a lot of sense. So John Dewey was an American psychologist, a philosopher. He was an educator, social critic, and political activist. He kind of took the mantle of education, and pedagogy, and trying to teach the student. At least that's what we've been studying. So he contributed in the fields of philosophy, pedagogy, and psychology. And he wanted to take a lot of that psychology world and apply it in a pedagogical manner. And so he wrote some, famous works, School and Society, and then the Democracy and Education in 1916. And so he is going to contribute immensely. At the time, he was a progressive. He was someone who kind of thought outside the box and tried to challenge the status quo. He was born in 1859 in Burlington, Vermont, and died in 1952 in New York, New York. He graduated from the University of Vermont in 1879. and obtained his PhD in 1884 from Johns Hopkins University, where he will kind of begin his tenure. He'll go to work at the University of Michigan first, but become the chairman of the Department of Philosophy, Psychology, and Pedagogy at the University of Chicago. He was a primary originator of both functionalism and behaviorism, while also inspiring other movements that shaped the 20th century thought, including empiricism, humanism, naturalism, contextualism, and process of philosophy, which just kind of breeds to what he is. And that is, he was a person who really wanted to make a difference in life. So in philosophy, he will be a pragmatist, although I don't think that he ever really said he was a pragmatist. Somebody gave him that moniker or that name. And so he believed that experimentation was a reliable enough way to determine the truth of a concept. And he wanted to basically people to learn by doing. And so he saw education as the way that we are supposed to do life, so to speak. And so as kids, or children, he wanted to equip them to become better, humans, and also more educated. But as we're going to see when we talk about some of this, it's hard to put in a box. Dewey's functionalism sought to consider organisms in total as they function in their environment, rather than being passive receivers of stimuli. Dewey perceived organisms as active perceivers. So he wants people to be active. He's all about action, which goes back to his pragmatism. And finally, his philosophy. Dewey's concept of instrumentalism in education stressed learning by doing, which was opposed to authoritarian teaching methods and rote learning, which was kind of the sit and get model. That honestly, we see a lot of schools and education do today. So he had this quote that I like: "Education is not an affair of telling and being told, but an active, constructive process." So that's to John Dewey to me.
Okay, so for me, the other philosopher that we chose for this that I picked was Paulo Freire. And for him, this quote is, "Education is freedom." And so for him, the idea is that education is a way of action for social movements and social injustices, a way to get out of those and to correct them. His background really shaped his ideas about education. He's one of the most influential philosophers of education. He's a pioneer of critical pedagogy, internalization, and critical consciousness. He criticized the banking model, which we'll get into a little bit later, the banking model of education, and characterized traditional education as oppression. So he saw traditional education as a way to keep the have-nots down. And so his most notable work was in 1968 in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He grew up in Brazil, and so that the economic crisis in Brazil is really what's going to shape his view on education. He was poor. He's able to go to school because he basically works and convinces people, to let him get an education. He became a grammar teacher while he was in high school, and he'll eventually become a director of education for the Industrial Social Service in Brazil. He was actually imprisoned and exiled in Brazil, which I didn't know that before until I started looking into it. He created a national literacy program, and during the time Brazil was under a militaristic regime, and they did not want him to run that campaign for literacy. And he was imprisoned, and I think it's for like 60 days, and then they eventually exiled him. And yeah,
Just gotta get rid of your problems, huh?
Yeah, I guess so. He was a visiting professor at Harvard, so that's when he left. After that, it was in 1969. So this is after he's written his Pedagogy of the Oppressed. His big contributions are the banking model. So that's the idea that students are empty, and it's the teachers that are the leaders, and they're the ones who are pouring the information into the student. And so the student's passive in the learning. And so there's no critical thought there. There's no critical thinking. And that continues that idea of oppression. His solution is problem posing education. So basically that we know it today, I think of it as like problem-based learning. And so that's what you let the students, you present the problem and you let students think critically about that. And that you're presenting social and political problems for them to solve and to think critically about. Another big contribution is the culture of silence. So he argued that oppressed people believe that they don't understand the world. And so they don't understand that they have the capability to speak out against their oppressors. And so it's that continuation of oppression. And then a good quote that I found from him is washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. So he's all about action and taking action to end for social justice.
Yeah, that's an interesting quote. So I guess we'll get into our philosophical discussion. And so we'll do our best to try to work this out and kind of talk through how we think these two philosophers would, discuss the issue of standardized testing. So in Dewey, he was all about functionalism. Well, not all about, but big part of him was functionalism and humanism, and basically wanting to take the holistic approach of a child. And so in standardized testing, functionalism, this is Dewey in his education, democracy and education. Functionalism sought to consider the total organism as it functioned in the environment and an active perceiver rather than a passive receiver of stimuli. And so for John Dewey, he would see standard-based testing as kind of the means to an end, but because the end is like hard to define for Dewey, it would be hard for his pupils, and his pupils would struggle to take a standardized test and be able to understand all of one aspect of an event. And I can, I'm coming from a historical perspective. So you got anything to add from that with Freire?
So compared to him?
Yeah.
So I guess they would see it the same way as that students need to be an active participant and that they have their own knowledge, they have their own experiences. And so that's what they use as the stimulus, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. So Freire, he says knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, and continuing, hopefully, inquiry human beings pursue in the world with each other. So for standardized testing, it wouldn't meet his idea of putting inquiry to go out into the world, for the students to go out to the world and solve those problems. It would just be, you're just spitting out the information. You're just recalling that information. So in his mind, he would see that as an actual assessment.
And I think that goes back to Dewey here, where he says, and I think I misquoted, by the way, on John Dewey. This was a website that I found on the first one, the functionalism. But the next quote, kind of comparing what you're talking about and with Dewey, with Freire, is too often the pupil comes out with a smattering, which is too superficial to be scientific and too technical to be applicable to ordinary affairs. And it kind of goes back to what you're talking about, or what Freire would be talking about, in that if we did education where it was just trying to reach an end goal of a good test score, then you would just have people who don't really understand what they've learned and they can't apply it.
Yeah, they're just yeah.
And so in Dewey's world, would it really be learning, or is it just spitting out facts? Mm-hmm. And so, as Freire would say, so Dewey would look at it very similar to what Freire would look at it, in the light of that it's just not true learning.
It's
It's
not,
just, yeah, it's just a passive receptacle, just
Mhm.
giving out whatever knowledge the teacher got. So we'll get to the banking model in a minute. So
yeah, 'cause
and then finally, as far as functionalism and humanism for Dewey, for Dewey, the recitation or summative assessment becomes the social clearinghouse where experiences are changed and subjected to criticism, where misconceptions are corrected and new lines of thought and inquiry are set up. So in Dewey's world, the summative assessment should not be one test on one day. It's going to be a plethora of answers to one question. It's whatever that student took out of the experience. And it's going to be, they're learning the basic skills of education, which is becoming lifelong learners, critical thinking, time management, the basic skills of education. And he wants to do that through, open learning, so to speak, and not this very informal, or I guess I should say formal, passive approach.
So Freire, I mean, I guess his solution to that is problem posing education. So that inquiry is where you're giving them a problem, and you're taking like that small picture and then applying it to the bigger picture. So he says a revolutionary leadership must accordingly practice co-intentional education. He's big about that relationship between the teacher and student, and that role, that authority role, that the teacher is an authority, that they work together. Teachers and students are both subjects, not only in the task of unveiling reality and thereby coming to know it critically, but in the task of recreating that knowledge. As they attain this knowledge of reality through common reflection and action. So he's all about that reflection and that action piece. They discover themselves as permanent recreators. So they are making that change in the world through reflection and action.
Right. And so I think when it comes to this portion of the standardized testing, when it comes to the functionality and the humanistic aspect of it, I don't think that Dewey and Freire really would have a lot of negatives for each other. Like they would agree more than they disagree.
But for different reasons.
Yeah, but for different reasons. And, obviously Dewey he didn't grow up in the perspective that Freire grew up with, and he grew up in America. He had, a formal training. He had some benefits in life. And so he doesn't quite understand the perspective probably of Freire, but I think they would both see the humanistic aspect of the learning, and they would approach the learning the same.
I agree. Yeah.
All right, so we'll go to the next slide, which is the banking model. And I'll let you start since this is more of a Freire type of learning or teaching or thought,
Okay.
I guess I should say.
Yeah. So I've kind of already gone into like the banking model. So that's the idea that the student is empty. They are the empty vessels, and it's the teacher that is the authority figure that's pouring the information in, and the student has nothing. It's passive learning. The student doesn't have anything to contribute. So his quote is, "The scope of action allowed to the students extends only as far as receiving, filing, and storing the deposits." So storing the information. And for him, that's that banking model. And so they have no part in the learning.
Right. And so that I think the contrast to that would be Dewey and him saying the aim of education is to enable individuals to continue their education, or that the object and reward of learning is continued capacity for growth, which is kind of contrasting, where it's agreeing with Freire, because Freire is saying this is the type of learning we don't want, and Dewey's kind of saying this is the type of learning we do want. And that's kind of what I was referring to on the last slide, in that he just sees learning as an open book kind of thing, and we should be able, we want to inspire them to grow. I can say personally that I have grown more in education outside of the educational world when it comes to especially high school. Wasn't a very good high school student, but as I've learned to love learning, I have learned a lot more. And I think that's what Dewey and Freire would both be saying about this type of instrument. And so when it comes to standardized testing, it's very hard. The banking model would work in standardized testing.
Yeah, because that's what they're assessing. Can you recall the information that's been poured
Right.
into? So
But-
I think, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I mean, Ferrer would be very critical in my mind of standardized testing just for that reason, because that's what you're looking at. Is they're not, it's not open ended, kind of like what you're saying with Dewey. It's more, can you regurgitate the information back to me?
Right. And so a Dewey would, all forms of character, mental and moral, but formation consists in the selection and coordination of native activities so that they may utilize the subject matter of the social environment. And so he's looking at learning as an act of justice, so to speak. And I think that would be kind of contrasting, or not contrasting, but similar to what Freire would think.
Definitely. You know, he criticizes the banking model a little bit more, but he talks about knowledge is a gift bestowed by those whom they consider to know nothing, projecting an absolute ignorance on others and a characteristic of ideology of oppression, negates education and knowledge as a process of inquiry. So it's that idea that we're giving you knowledge, but it's only what the information that we want you to know.
Got a little notification there. I guess we're going longer than we thought.
Yeah.
And so finally, I'll go ahead for your final, and then I'll.
Okay, so his solution is the discussion. He's all about dialogical pedagogy, and so problem posing education is the solution to the banking model. So a constant unveiling of reality, an emergence of consciousness, and critical intervention in reality. So that unveiling of reality, and he mentions that you have to constantly check your thinking in order to be critical and encourage your students to be critical.
Yeah. So there's no limit to the meaning which an action may come to possess. It all depends on the context of the perceived connections in which it is placed. The reach of imagination in realizing connections is inexhaustible. And so this kind of, again, leads to the idea that the banking model is not the appropriate model for learning, and standardized testing would be it would be hard to assess knowledge that for kids, because it's kind of an open, it's based on their imagination. It's open to what they see and believe, or what they learn from the content, so to speak. And so I think where we would come to a little bit of disagreement is not that we would both agree on the banking model. We would disagree on the solutions or the process of getting there. Does that make sense? So, you know, as a pragmatist, it's about learning and doing. I don't really see, I don't see the oppression.
Yeah, for that's
as-
all it is. Yeah, is the injustice. So Dewey wouldn't have that. Yeah, he wouldn't see it.
I think we come to the same conclusion. We just have a different means of reaching that conclusion. So that kind of just gets to the end of our philosophical discussion. So now we're going to provide our personal perspectives. As a teacher, as I said earlier, of a content course that has an end of course test, I feel pressure every day to perform. Today, I felt like we did a lot of passive learning. We did a lot of this, you know, model that Dewey's talking about. And it's hard for me to create content that the kids can kind of take and go with because I have to worry about EOC scores, and they have to be, you know, I'm accountable to those EOC scores. So John Dewey would view standardized testing as a negative and not applicable method for evaluating acquired knowledge. I just believe that. So, and for me, education is life, and I would agree with Dewey in that. And so it is not indicative of the type of teaching that should take place in the classroom. So finally, because learning is doing, each student's knowledge acquisition may not be the same. So therefore, for me, I'm going to be in agreements with Dewey, and I took a lot of his application to heart.
Okay, for me, I'm in the same boat. I have the Georgia Milestones course, so I understand the pressure of standardized testing as a teacher. I understand that there has to be accountability, like from the top, you know, from the state. I understand that they use it as a form of assessment to kind of see you know, a way to measure progress in schools and students. And I understand the accountability, but I definitely think that there could be a different method to measure that, to have that accountability, and maybe for it to be so tied to teacher and student performance. Freire, he viewed standardized testing, he would view it as unjust and cultural appropriation, depending on the questions, and driven by money. That's another thing that he talks about as a form of oppression. And therefore, you know, it's continuing, the oppressor is continuing to oppress through standardized testing. He would also argue that it's not a true measure of understanding, and because it's an assessment of that banking model idea. I agree that Prairie, you know, the critical thinking is vital to the student and to progress. We want students to think critically. You know, that's part of our democratic system. That's one of our goals. You know, our school system's goal is to create learners, lifelong learners, and citizens of the world. And so I understand that. I see his idea, the problem-based education model and dialogical pedagogy discourse, you know, would be his measure as opposed to standardized testing. But I also see Dewey. I do a lot of my things with Dewey, you know, his principles. I try to implement a lot of his ideas into my strategy. So I definitely see Dewey, his ideas in my teaching. But I see value in both for sure.
Well, good discussion. I enjoyed this project, and I'll work with you sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
Bye. Oh, here's our bibliography. So all of our sourcing. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.